So now let's take a look at Meiji reform in terms of foreign policy. And as we discussed, this was the second part of the approach to pursue empire. First being modernization, second with foreign policy. Now, first of all, before the Meiji period, Japan was very similar to the United States insofar as it was isolationist in its foreign policy. In fact, more isolationist than the United States during the 19th century. Now, that's because it held a view of distrust towards the outside world. And indeed, European empires were aware of this profound distrust that Japan held towards the rest of the world. So, as you can imagine, with the Meiji Restoration, however, this led to pretty much the complete abandonment of that tradition of isolationism. Now, as we learned, Japan had aspirations that are similar to America at that time. America had aspirations towards global empire, and so too now with Japan. But the question is, where would Japan's sphere of influence, to use our term, where would that be cast towards, geographically speaking? Well, as you can imagine, it's going to be towards the area, at least initially, that are nearby to Japan, the areas surrounding Japan, because as opposed to the United States, which was an entire continent for the most part, Japan was an island, and needless to say, much smaller. So they looked around and immediately noticed that Korea was a site set by other empires, specifically, as we'll discuss, Russia, okay? And to an extent, China. So Japan knew that should that happen, for example, should Russia gain control of the Korean peninsula, well, they're too close for comfort when it comes to proximity to Japan. So therefore, in their initial imperial goals, they wanted to establish a sphere of influence, certainly in Korea, but also this area called Manchuria. Now, on this map, it's called Manchukuo. That's the name. Manchukuo is the name given for the Japanese colony that would be established by 1931. So this map is a little ahead of when we're talking about, but Manchuria is basically this area as being designated right now. And also some of the islands south of Japan, like what's known as the Ryukyu Islands. Okinawa is right there. And also some islands a little bit to, or south of that, okay? And that's Taiwan, or Formosa as it used to be called. All right, so these were the areas that were deemed important geostrategically for the Imperial Japan. Okay, so we see this actually in effect, that is to say, the attempt to annex Korea, happening with what's called here on the slide the First Sino-Japanese War between China and Japan. Breaks out in 1894 and lasts about a year. And this was fought again over the right to annex Korea. Now, Korea, I kind of alluded to earlier, is considered a crucial buffer zone, if you will, between Japan and China and Russia. Hence, occupation was deemed to be crucial for Japanese imperialists. And with the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894, well, it turned out to be a decisive victory for Japan. Now, interestingly enough, now that it's an Asian power, Japan forces an unequal treaty upon China, okay, leading to, again, the gain of Korea and Taiwan. Back then it was called Formosa. So look at that. Now Japan is imposing unequal treaties upon parts of Asia, just as Western powers were doing unto China and to Japan earlier. Okay, so the next war we see that Japan is engaged in is against the Russian Empire. And this is the Japanese War that erupts 10 years after the first Sino-Japanese War. And this is definitely an imperial war where you have the Russian Empire against the Japanese Empire. We have to remember the Japanese Empire is newly established. The Russian Empire had been around for a long time before that. Now, Japan is fighting to suppress Russia's imperial ambitions in Manchuria, in this region, as being pointed out now. And what happens is that Japan defeats Russia. And in the process, Japan becomes the first Asian power to defeat a European empire. So this is of world historical importance here. The first Asian power to defeat a European empire. So due to the defeat of the Russian Empire by Japan, well, this impressed other European empires. They were forced to acknowledge that Japan was now a major player on the world stage. And indeed, it actually made other Asian countries, it made them aware of the fact that they could possibly overcome European hegemony in the Pacific. That is to say, European domination. So other countries were impressed as well. They, quote unquote, woke up, right, with this victory. Now, despite impressive modernization, despite these war victories, there is growing Japanese disdain towards the West and towards the United States. They were now in league with the great European empires, as I mentioned, but they still felt disrespected due to racial reasons, mainly that they were still seen as the inferior Oriental. For example, this is seen in the Treaty of Versailles, which we discussed, that ended World War I. And during this time, Japan took the opportunity to demand racial equality, to demand that this racial equality clause be included in the League of Nations that just got established by Woodrow Wilson. So you see that in the slide here. Western empires forced to recognize the Japanese Empire because of their military might, though still they consider the Japanese as racially inferior. This leads again to Japanese resentment towards the West and the U.S. And you see that reflected in two policies when it comes to resentment towards the U.S. The Gentleman's Agreement in 1907 and the Open Door Policy in Asia. So what is the Gentleman's Agreement Act first? Well, for this, you need a little background. By 1907, there's already a significant number of Japanese laborers that migrated to the U.S. West Coast. What are they doing there, by the way? Well, if you're familiar with the Chinese who worked on the railroad and the mining industry in the West Coast, like California and all through, let's say, Oregon and Washington. Well, they were kicked out by 1882 with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. But Western industries, like agribusiness, like the mining industry, like the railroad companies, they needed their cheap labor. And they found that labor overseas, and they still turned to Asia for that. So in order to replace the Chinese, they went to Japan. And an agreement was forged with the government of Japan, whereby by the end of the 1800s, by the 1890s, you see thousands, in fact, tens of thousands of Japanese migrating to the U.S. West and Hawaii, by the way, to work on the plantations there, but also to the U.S. West to work as farmers predominantly on the West Coast. But because of their increasing presence and because of the proliferation of Japanese families that are being established, they're having children, and these children are becoming U.S. citizens, well, a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment emerged. By the early 1900s, there was this fear that the Japanese would take over the West Coast, racially replace whites on the West Coast. and so on and so forth. And the name that you could call these anti-immigrants is, well, the general ideology is called nativism. Okay, nativism. Nativism refers to anti-immigrant sentiment. And in this case, it's basically against the Japanese that we're discussing. So, there was a great earthquake that happened in San Francisco in the early 1900s. And this great San Francisco quake, as they called it, basically destroyed a lot of the infrastructure in San Francisco. Now, before the earthquake, the Japanese school children used to attend the same schools as white children. It was not racially segregated. But even before the earthquake, the nativists began to demand that the Japanese and some of the Koreans who were around because of colonization, as we discussed, the Japanese and the lesser amount of Korean school children must be segregated from white schools in San Francisco. But then the earthquake struck, and the nativists took this opportunity to put into law that there should be segregation in education among school children. They required that the Japanese and Korean school children only attend so-called Oriental schools. Okay, now, this angered Japanese parents on the West Coast because they felt that their children would be subject to inferior education, and they placed high value in education, these immigrant workers. So they complained to the Japanese government, and because the Japanese government is now established and not only modern but well respected, as I mentioned, well, the Japanese began to launch complaints against the U.S. government. And as I mentioned, the U.S. was forced to listen because they respect the Japanese government, the Japanese nation, Imperial Japan. So this led the president himself, which was Theodore Roosevelt. It led him to personally take charge of diplomacy because he respected the heck out of the Japanese empire. And a negotiation was struck, which is called, as noted here, the Gentleman's Agreement, 1907. And here's how they resolved the conflict. Roosevelt said this: okay, the United States would not segregate Japanese and Korean school children. They would not force them into so-called Oriental schools. Okay, but in return, the Japanese could no longer send immigrant laborers to the West Coast. So that is how they reconciled. That's how they compromised here in this tension that erupted. Okay, and that's the Gentleman's Agreement. And what that reflects is the U.S. acknowledgement of the Japanese Empire as being great. With the aforementioned 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act that kicked out the Chinese from the West Coast earlier in the 1880s, China was so weak, as we discussed actually, that they could not protect their subjects abroad, their citizens abroad. But here is a different case where the Japanese could indeed protect by virtue of their reputation and status on the world stage. Now, the other policy that antagonized Japan is something that was announced by the United States, a policy that was announced called the Open Door Policy, and basically says this. Basically, the United States is telling other European empires that they don't have this monopolistic hold over any particular Asian country, that they have to, quote unquote, open the door, keep the door open to allow other European empires to establish their presence in that particular Asian country. Okay, so that's called the Open Door Policy. And very imperialistic as it sounds like, right? It's saying, hey, this area is up for grabs for any Western empire.